Okay. Do you want me to go ahead and start, or? Okay. All right. So I was originally going to be doing a Pro-Life 101, and then I kind of changed this at near the last minute. So I've got some notes here with me. I don't have it quite committed to memory yet. So, but the material I know. It's just this is to keep me on track, make sure I don't forget anything. So, yeah. Okay. So, and I'm going to make this a little bit interactive too. So I'm going to be asking some questions of you as well. So to start off with, how many of you usually engage in a lot of conversations on controversial topics, whether it be a topic like abortion or same-sex marriage, or even just sharing your faith or lack of faith, case depending? Some? Okay, well, as you have these kinds of discussions, what's often going to happen is, well, especially if you haven't really taken any sort of training for like apologetics training or speaker training or anything like that, what can often happen is the two people who are having discussions can actually talk past each other. That one person is saying one thing, the other person is saying another thing, and they don't really have a common definition of what they're talking about. And so they can end up just kind of talking past each other. And so sometimes it can get real ugly, as we sometimes see when you talk about something that's really politically charged, something that people have, deep feelings about, that they really hold onto this position passionately. Sometimes you can get the yelling, the name calling. It could be kind of a real ugly conversation. And then other times it can be a little bit more civil, but still kind of a bad conversation where nothing is really done, nothing's really moving forward because both people have kind of different ideas of what they're talking about in mind. And so Greg Kokel, in his book Tactics, has actually recommended three questions that we ask whenever we have these kinds of discussions. And so these questions are, what do you mean by that? Which is a question you can ask for clarification. And then, how did you come to that conclusion? Which is now a question asking them how they, what kind of evidence they have for their view. And then the third one is, have you considered the implications of your view? Which is then asking them if they've actually sat down and kind of considered what their particular view leads to, the implications of it. So the topic that I have under discussion today is I'm going to talk about 8 bad ways that people argue for abortion. And the reason that this is significant um, is because if you're having these conversations with people and you're not really aware of what pro-choice people believe, then you might not understand where the person is coming from. And so you can either use these Columbo questions to gather information about their view, or you can kind of do the preliminary work of reading what the pro-choice thinkers are arguing, and then that way you'll have a little bit of kind of an idea. But even then, when you're talking to an individual person, they still might not have read the literature on abortion. And so they might have still a different idea than what you might have. And so it's still really good to ask these questions. And so this is not going to be specifically a comprehensive view of the pro-choice arguments, because I could probably be here for 3 or 4 hours or longer to talk about the entire scope of arguments that you're going to hear. But I'm going to talk about most of the most common ones that you'll hear, either from those in the literature or from the average person that you meet, either on the college campus or talking on social media. So I think only one person here attended my talk on Tuesday, right? Yeah. So do you have a kind of a fairly good idea of what the pro-life argument is? Okay, so I'll just cover it in a nutshell real quick, because I'm really not going to spend time covering the pro-life argument. This talk is merely just geared towards talking about what pro-choice people argue in support of abortion. So pro-life people argue that the science shows that human life begins at fertilization, and the embryologists are all consistently agreeing on this point. Ever since the mid to late 1800s, we've known scientifically that human life begins at fertilization, and so science has shown us that the unborn human being is alive, is human, is an individual, and is an organism from fertilization. It's a whole individual organism of the human species. And then philosophically, we know that there's no change from fertilization until it comes outside the womb that changes it into something that doesn't have rights, into something that does have rights. There are a lot of changes. It gets bigger, it gets more developed, it gets less dependent on the mother's body, but none of these changes are changes that change the nature of the individual from something that we should not protect into something that we should. And so that's the pro-life argument in a nutshell. So I've written on the board here. Hopefully you can see it. If not, it's okay. I'll be reiterating these things so that nobody gets lost. But I did write them down here too, so we can kind of track with where we're going. So the 8 bad ways that people argue for abortion, and we'll cover all of these in a little more detail as we get to them as well. That number 1, pro-choice people assume the unborn are not human. Number 2, they assert rather than argue. Number 3, they attack the person instead of attacking the argument. Number 4, they confuse moral claims with preference claims. Number 5, they advance a radical bodily rights theory. Number 6, they twist scripture. Number 7, they confuse contingent evils with absolute evils. And number 8, they hide behind the hard cases. So number 1, the first bad way that people tend to argue for abortion is they assume that the unborn are not human. And these kinds of arguments usually are arguments from situations. For example, if they argue that abortion is necessary because a woman might not be able to afford a child. So poverty is one situation in which they might argue that abortion is necessary. But there's a problem with that. The problem with that is that abortion would only be permissible in the situation of poverty if the unborn is not a human being. And so if they advance the argument that we need abortion because some women are too poor to afford a child, well, they're assuming that the unborn is not a human being rather than arguing for it in order to make their case that we need abortion. So in order to show somebody that they're assuming, not arguing that the unborn is a human being, we can use a technique called trot out the toddler, which was developed by Scott Klusendorf of Life Training Institute, which is the organization that I work for. So we can find common ground with the person who argues from poverty, because obviously we believe that poverty is a very difficult situation, and we don't want people to remain in poverty. We want to help them out as much as they can. But then we can look at a toddler, an older child, one that's not in the womb, a toddler, and ask, okay, so now let's fast forward a couple of years. Now we're not talking about the unborn. Now we're talking about a toddler. And let's say a woman just lost her job, maybe her husband or boyfriend walked out on her, and now she's left alone with this toddler that she doesn't think that she can afford. Well, would we then say that she would be justified in killing her toddler because of poverty? Well, obviously we'd say no. And of course the question is, well, why not? Well, it's because the toddler is human, right? You can't just kill humans for reasons of poverty. And so that's the issue. And by using trot out the toddler, we can actually get the pro-choice person that we're talking to realize for him or herself that we have to decide first if the unborn human being is a human before we can decide whether or not we can kill him through abortion for poverty. Because if we can't kill the toddler for reasons of poverty, then we wouldn't be able to kill the unborn if the unborn is a human being. Another way that a pro-choice person might argue is they might appeal to the dangers of back alley abortions. And this is a common one. They'll say something like, if we ever make abortion illegal, well, women are just going to seek very dangerous abortions in back alleys. They're going to use coat hangers instead of being able to get a legal, safe abortion. But again, this assumes rather than argues that the unborn is human. Because if the unborn is a human being, then we can't justify legalizing abortion just because a woman might seek a dangerous abortion or an illegal abortion. As Scott Klusendorf says, why should the law be faulted for making it more difficult or more dangerous to kill human beings? Well, it shouldn't be faulted. So just arguing that it's going to be more dangerous or more difficult to kill this unborn entity is assuming rather than arguing that the unborn is a human being. And so certain other situations as well, like you have people who argue that it's a woman's right to choose whether or not to have abortion, or that we need to trust women. We need to trust women to make the right decision. Both of these situations assume rather than argue that the unborn is a human being. Right, and then other situations like, you're forcing your morality on me, those kinds of things. So all of these situations are assuming rather than arguing that the unborn is a human at the beginning of this, but especially considering that pro-life people actually do make a case that the unborn is a human person. Then if the pro-choice person is going to try and argue for the permissibility of abortion, then they can't just assume that the unborn are human beings. They have to argue that they're not. Either present their own case that the unborn are not persons, or they can try to respond to our argument. The problem is, if you read enough of the literature, very few people actually try to make a case that the unborn are human beings. If you read philosophers like Peter Singer or Michael Tooley, they agree with the science that human life begins at fertilization. But they try to argue that it's not a person, that it's not something that has rights. But if you're not reading a philosopher, if you're reading someone like a feminist writer or just someone generally making the case for the pro-choice position, you're not generally going to find them trying to make a case that the unborn are not human. They're going to appeal to other reasons why we need abortion. So this is the first bad way that people tend to argue for abortion, is that they assume rather than arguing. The second bad way that people argue for abortion is they assert rather than argue. Now, can someone tell me what the difference is between asserting and arguing? It's something that a lot of people tend to confuse, especially in discussions over social media. For a free round trip, what's like a very, very small like podunk town around here in South Carolina?
Rock Hill.
Okay, for free round trip tickets to Rock Hill. Yeah, because actually my pastor always offers free round trip tickets to Pixley, which is like a very, very small town that no one ever goes to, and so it's always safe to grant free round trip tickets to Pixley. But yeah, okay. So basically, the difference between asserting and arguing is if you assert something, then you're putting something forth without proper evidence, and if you argue for something, then you are giving proper evidence for your position. Now, there are some people who would say that science is the final arbiter of human knowledge, and that you can't know anything if you can't prove it scientifically. But can anybody tell me what's the issue with believing that? Like, what's wrong with believing that that only science can tell us what's true?
Does it have really ethics?
I'm sorry, say that again?
There's no ethics.
Okay, yeah, you can't prove ethics scientifically, sure. So that would mean that you can't make ethical claims. Yeah. So the problem with believing, yeah, and of course that doesn't leave room for faith either. But the problem with arguing that science is the only way we can have knowledge is that that's not a statement that you can prove scientifically. So it actually defeats itself. It's what we call a self-refuting proposition, because it basically defeats itself. It cannot live up to its own standard of truth. Greg Koukl calls these kinds of statements that commit suicide. They just don't work. So you can use scientific evidence to prove your case. If you present an argument, you can use scientific evidence, but also presenting a logical case, presenting a logical syllogism, for example, because logical syllogisms are deductive arguments, and deductive arguments cannot be false if the premises are true. So you can also present, say, a logical syllogism to prove your case. Even if you don't necessarily have scientific evidence, you can still use a logical argument to prove your case as well. So the difference between an assertion and an argument is an assertion is a statement is a statement produced without evidence, and an argument is a multiplicity of statements with a conclusion that does have supporting arguments or supporting evidence behind it. So that's something that's always confused. I always see those two terms being confused on social media. But okay, so how do they assert then rather than argue? Well, for example, they can assert the statement that women have a right to choose. Well, this is an assertion because they're not specific on what it is that we're talking about. Women have a right to choose. Okay, to choose what? Well, you have to define what it is you're choosing before you can decide whether or not you can make that choice. Because what if, for example, I would say that men have a right to choose. And I'm sure a lot of people would agree with that. But what if the topic under consideration is rape? Well, I don't think that men should be able to choose to rape somebody. So obviously, you have to define what it is you're choosing before you can decide whether or not it's something you can appropriately choose. And so we can go back to these Columbo questions. Greg Koukl calls them Columbo questions because they refer to an old television detective named Columbo, which you may or may not be familiar with. He was a little bit before my time. But for me, it's Adrian Monk. But Columbo is someone who was kind of an unassuming detective, but would always ask these pointed questions to get at the heart of what someone was trying get around or beat around the bush. And so using these Columbo questions, the first question is, what do you mean by that? So if someone says, I believe that women have the right to choose, well, the first question we can ask is, well, what do you mean by choose? Um, okay, well, I think that women should, be able to choose to have an abortion. And then you can ask them, how did they come to that conclusion, which is the second Columbo question. And then, of course, they'll give you their reasons that, they believe that women have free will or whatever their underlying assumptions might be. And then the third question is, have you considered the implications of your view? And so, if we just grant an unadulterated right to choose, then have you considered that there are a lot of bad, immoral things, even dangerous things that we would be allowing people to choose if we didn't restrict people's abilities to choose certain things? So that's a way in which we can use these three questions to show people that they have these hidden assumptions behind their statements. So another kind of statement that they assert rather than argue is that, for example, the unborn are not self-aware. Well, what's our first Columbo question? Our first Columbo question is, what do you mean by that? So if someone says, well, the unborn are not self-aware, well, what do you mean by self-aware? What do you mean that the unborn are not self-aware? What does that mean to you? Well, by not being self-aware, I mean, I don't think that they're aware of their own existence. They can't really see themselves as an existing thing, and so I don't think abortion is actually doing them any harm. Well, our second Columbo question then, how did you come to that conclusion? Well, it's just scientists have shown that they're not self-aware. They can't value their own existence in the womb. That's just, they don't have the mental hardware for that yet. So then the third question, have you considered the implication of your view? Well, have you considered that we're actually not self-aware until sometime after our first or second birthday? So if you're going to justify abortion because the unborn are not self-aware, then you'd also have to justify infanticide as well, because infants are not self-aware. And so these kinds of questions, again, are getting at the hidden assumptions under their view. And then another one, so you'll sometimes hear that people will say, well, the embryos are just clumps of cells. They're just insensate tissue. So again, question number one, everybody repeat after me. What do you mean by that?
What do you mean by that?
What do you mean? Yes, excellent. Okay, yes, great question. Well, I just mean that they're like little clumps of cells. They're just a collection of human tissue and stuff. Okay, so the second question, how did you come to that conclusion? Repeat after me. How did you come to that conclusion? Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Well, I mean, I've seen pictures of early embryos, and they just look like clumps of cells to me. And the question number three is, have you considered the implications of your view?
Have you ever considered the implications of your view?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I guess if they're, I don't know, because, I guess they are different than, say like a clump of skin cells, so I guess there is something kind of different about the embryo that looks like a clump of cells. So these three questions will really get at the heart of someone. And so have you considered the implications of review is also kind of a general question. You might need to specify it a little bit by turning it back on their question, but go ahead. Sure. Right. Yeah, so these three questions. So the first one we looked at, assuming the unborn are not human, and we talked about trotting out the toddler, how trotting out the toddler is a good way to show people the assumptions behind these views. Number two, we're talking about how people sometimes assert rather than argue. And so by using these three Columbo questions that Greg Koukl talks about in his book Tactics, we can actually show the person the underlying assumptions that they're asserting rather than arguing. Okay, so number three is that they attack the person instead of the argument. Now, in logical terms, we call this an ad hominem fallacy. And this means that if someone presents an argument to you and you attack something that's irrelevant about their character, then you're not really refuting the argument. Because someone can be a terrible person, and yet they can still be making a valid and sound logical argument. So for example, a common one here, actually I don't know how many conversations you've had on the topic of abortion, but can someone think off the top of their head of an argument that someone sometimes uses to attack the character of pro-life people? Yeah.
Well, if you happen to be a man
Yeah, that's a common one. You're a man, you can't get pregnant, you have no right to speak on abortion. Yeah, so that's attacking the person instead of the argument. As a pro-life philosopher Frank Beckwith says, arguments don't have gender, people do. So yeah, it's true that men can't get pregnant. Thank you for pointing out that biological reality. But my being a male doesn't preclude me from being able to make reasonable arguments on moral issues. So if we're talking about the topic of abortion, yeah, it's true that I can't get pregnant. So there is a sense in which I can't really understand what a pregnant woman is going through, but that doesn't preclude the ability of me to be able to make a moral judgment, because there are a number of things that I can't really understand that I can still make moral judgments on. In fact, my friend Timothy Brahm from the Equal Rights Institute actually uses an example that I believe he wrote this in one of his articles that he writes for the Equal Rights Institute. But for example, suppose I was out well, yeah, what's like a nearby lake that you have around here?
Yeah, Lake Wiley.
Oh, what is it?
Lake Wiley.
Lake Wiley. Okay. Yeah, because I was going to say like Huntington Lake or something, but I don't know if you've heard about any California lakes. But suppose I was there at that lake and I see a woman pushing a car into the lake, and I think, oh, that's kind of funny. That's odd behavior. So I go over to investigate, and I realize that she's a distraught mother, and she has her 2-year-old child in the car, and she's pushing the child into the lake because she's had all that she can stand. She's having a very difficult time of things. Well, I'm not a mother or even a parent. I can't really understand what it is that she's going through, but doesn't it seem like I have the right to step in and try to save the life of the child that she's trying to kill? Well, I would say that I have that right, even though I don't necessarily have the ability to know what it is that she's going through. I think that I still have the ability to prevent that from happening, and as well as making moral judgments on this. And so there's nothing really about the topic of abortion that precludes me as a man from being able to make these judgments. In fact, there are also a lot of women who can't get pregnant, women who are infertile or are too old to have children, and yet I think they're still able to come to conclusion on this moral issue as well. So arguing that male pro-life people should stay out of the conversation because they're male is attacking an irrelevant characteristic about the pro-life person and trying to silence their argument. So it doesn't refute the pro-life argument, because there are a lot of pro-life women, and a lot of them are my friends, and they make the same arguments that I do. So if it helps, just pretend I'm a woman and try to refute my argument. Okay, so yeah, so that's a common one. Another common one that we often hear is that you can't oppose abortion unless you adopt children. How many children have you adopted? Well, I haven't actually adopted any. Well, then, what right do you have to tell me that I can't have an abortion? And again, so the point behind pointing these out is that I could be the worst person in the world. I could be the second coming of Adolf Hitler. I could go around kicking puppies. I can, be this really, really horrible person. But if I was, suppose I'm worse than this pro-choice person thinks I am, how does that refute my argument that abortion is immoral because it intentionally and unjustly kills an innocent human being? Well, it doesn't. A lot of pro-life people do adopt children, but from a standpoint of trying to respond to the argument, that's not something we really need to point out. All we have to ask is, suppose I'm even worse than you think I am. How does that refute my argument? Well, it doesn't. So these arguments are just what we call ad hominem arguments. They attack the person rather than attacking the argument itself. Now, we do have good responses to their arguments, but which, if you have time, maybe you can address. But otherwise, you can just ask them, how does that refute my argument? And obviously, it wouldn't. Okay, so number 3, they attack the person instead of the argument. So number 4 is they confuse moral claims with preference claims. And this is something that we see often as well. So what would you think of me if I were to say, for example, you are immoral if you don't think that mint chocolate chip ice cream is the best kind of ice cream that there ever was? Would you be satisfied with that argument? Would you run off to confession because you might not agree with my position? No, I wouldn't think you would. What if I said, you have a moral obligation to use a number 2 pencil whenever you write an article for someone? No, that's obviously not correct either. All of these are preference claims. It's your preference that, or it's my preference that mint chocolate chip is the best kind of ice cream, but you might disagree, you heathens. You might think it's vanilla or chocolate, so you might have a different preference than I do, and you might prefer to write in pen when you write an article or something for school. And so all of these are preference claims. So these should not be confused with moral claims. A moral claim would be something like, it is immoral for you to for you to murder somebody. Putting a moral claim on the same level as a preference claim is what they tend to do in the abortion issue. So they take these moral claims, and just using this as an example, like they would be saying, the moral prescription we have against murder is more along the line of a preference claim. So they would say, you've probably heard the slogan, what's right for me is right for me, what's right for you is what's right for you. So I have my own moral code, you have your own moral code, don't try to tell me what to do. And so that's what they do when they confuse a moral claim with a preference claim. Because, I couldn't see, you all laughed when I made the joke about the ice cream. I couldn't seriously try and tell you that it would be immoral for you not to like the same kind of ice cream I do, because that's a preference. And so when someone says that, for example, abortion I believe abortion is moral, you believe it's immoral, so you don't go have any abortions, I'll go have my abortion because I think it's right and you think it's wrong. They're relegating it to a statement no different than saying, you like chocolate ice cream, I like mint chocolate chip, so you go do your thing, I'll go do my thing. And so they're putting a moral claim on the same level as a preference claim. And this is something that is easy for a lot of people to do, and it's a way for them to escape having to address the argument, but it doesn't actually refute the argument. Our argument is that there's an actual moral prescription against having an abortion. We believe that having an abortion is immoral. And so if we believe that it's immoral, then we're not making the claim that it's right for some people and it's wrong for some people. We're making the claim that it's wrong for everybody. And so if they want to refute our argument, they have to address it on those terms, not on the terms that they're more comfortable with addressing. Okay, so that was confusing moral claims with preference claims. Number 5 is they advance a radical bodily rights theory. And we addressed this in some detail on Tuesday, but basically bodily rights arguments tend to take a couple of different forms. There's a couple more, but the two most common that you'll find are that some people believe that a woman's body is like a sovereign zone. And you're not going to hear the term sovereign zone, but they kind of consider it like a sovereign zone. Like they'll say, I believe, a woman can do anything she wants with anything inside her body. The other kind of bodily rights argument is what we call a right to refuse argument. And that's the argument that a woman should not be legally compelled to remain plugged in as life support, even to her own unborn child. So Trent Horn is a pro-life advocate that we credit with coming up with this distinction. And so when we look at the sovereign zone type of argument, the way that we address the sovereign zone argument, the idea that a woman has the right to do anything she wants with anything inside her body, is that we can bring up certain situations that show that a woman doesn't actually have that right that the person thinks she does. And this is actually a pretty easy argument to refute because it makes a very, very strong claim that's very difficult to justify. So the first thing that we can talk about is that if it was true that her body was a sovereign zone, that she could do anything she wants with anything in her body, well then any type of abortion would be permissible. She could, for example, have a sex-selective abortion. If she's having a girl but wanted a boy, she could have an abortion for that reason. Or a frivolous abortion. She could have an abortion because she's 9 months pregnant, but she wants to fly overseas to go see Rome. So all of these types of abortions would be permissible. And this is problematic for most pro-choice people because Gallup polls have shown us that the majority of Americans, even pro-choice people, believe that there should be some restrictions on abortion. They believe that sex-selective abortion should be illegal, or that frivolous abortions should be illegal, that she shouldn't just get an abortion for any reason. It should be a sufficiently difficult situation. Or most of them even believe that late-term abortions ought to be illegal, that it should only be done in the early term, because by the late term it definitely is a baby by that point. So to most pro-choice people, it will be problematic to argue that if her body was a sovereign zone, all abortions would be permissible, even if we particularly found them distasteful. But occasionally you'll get some people who will say, okay, I can track with that. I believe that those kinds of abortions should be legal because I think she has that right to do whatever she wants. Well, then we can bring up some situations. We can talk about, for example, the cancer drug thalidomide. It was a cancer treatment drug, and it was discovered that thalidomide could actually treat morning sickness in women. And so doctors started prescribing it, but on down the road, they discovered that it was actually causing birth defects in children, and so they took it off the market. So suppose a woman is having severe morning sickness and wants to obtain some thalidomide. Well, if she goes to the black market and obtains some thalidomide and takes it, does she have the moral right to do so? Well, if she has the right to do whatever she wants with anything in her body, then it seems like she should have that moral right to do so. And of course, that again would be problematic for most people because you're actually damaging the unborn child for the purpose of easing the morning sickness that she has. But if the person you're talking to still says, yeah, I think that would be okay. You know, I think her morning sickness would take precedence in this situation. Well, we could push it a little further. Suppose now she took the thalidomide and had a deformed child, and she really enjoyed, really appreciated all of the accolades she was receiving, and loved all the attention and the accusations of heroism that she was receiving from people, and she wants to go through it again. And so now she takes thalidomide to intentionally deform her child. Would that kind of action be permissible? Well, if the argument is correct that she has the right to do whatever she wants with anything in her body, then that would be permissible. She would have that right because the unborn human being has no rights because it's attached to her body, it's inside her body. But I think most people would say that, no, that's not right. We can't allow that. Now, occasionally, you'll encounter a first-year philosophy student who really wants to guard intellectual turf and may still bite these bullets. So there are more darker ways that we can go with this. I'm not going to go into them right now, but just suffice it to say that the thalidomide example should be sufficient for most people. But there are more dark situations that we can concoct to show that she doesn't actually have this right. So it seems pretty obvious then that the sovereign zone argument fails, that she doesn't have the right to do just anything she wants to anything in her body. But there's a second type of bodily rights case, one that makes a weaker claim, so that makes it actually a stronger argument because it makes a more modest claim upon the situation. And this argument is that a woman should not be forced to remain plugged in as life support to anyone, even an unborn child. And this kind of argument goes back to Judith Jarvis Thomson, who wrote an essay in 1972 called A Defense of Abortion. And her thought experiment goes like this. She says, suppose you wake up one morning and you're back to back in bed with a famous violinist and you're attached at the kidneys. You try to get up, but you can't because you're attached. The curator of the hospital runs in and says, oh, great, you're awake. I'm terribly sorry about this, but this violinist that you're in bed with is suffering from a deadly kidney ailment. Now, the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all possible or potential donors and found that you're the only match. So they kidnapped you, they drugged you, and they put you in bed and connected you to this violinist. And now you're keeping him alive because you're basically filtering out the blood, the act that his kidneys can't do. But don't worry, you only need to be plugged in for 9 months, and then you can leave. So do you see how she's trying to draw this as a parallel to pregnancy? Yeah, and her argument even goes a step further with the modesty. She says, it's possible you may have a moral obligation to that violinist, but that moral obligation that you might have should not translate into a legal obligation. You should not have a legal obligation to remain plugged in if you don't want to. So how do we respond to this kind of argument? Well, it seems powerful on the face of it. Like if it's your first time ever hearing it, it might seem pretty powerful to you. But as you start to think about it, and as you start to read the thinkers in literature on abortion, you start to see that there's actually a lot of problems with this violinist analogy. So there are actually a number of disanalogies, at least 6 or 7 that I could bring up that I think show that the analogy doesn't work. But I'm only going to bring up the 3 biggest disanalogies that are present between the situation of pregnancy and the situation of the bodily rights argument. So number one is the parent versus stranger objection. When we're talking about the situation of the violinist, we're dealing with two perfect strangers. But in the situation of pregnancy, we're dealing with a mother-child relationship. So certainly, a parent has obligations to her offspring that you don't have to a perfect stranger. So it seems like even if you didn't have an obligation to that stranger to remain plugged in, it seems like a parent should have an obligation to provide basic care to her own child. So the parent versus stranger objection, I think, shows that the two situations are not analogous. Another disanalogy is the responsibility objection. And this objection states that you are not responsible for the situation that the violinist finds himself in. It's the kidney ailment that is being responsible for his dying, essentially. But in the vast majority of cases, the woman and man engage in an act that makes her pregnant. She is responsible for the child, not just the child's existence, but placing the child in a state of dependence upon her body. So since she is responsible for placing that child in a state of dependence, she has a responsibility then to remain plugged in to that child and provide that child basic care, like a proper environment and proper nutrition. So that's the second disanalogy. The third disanalogy is the distinction between direct killing and indirect killing. If you unplug yourself from the violinist, you are not the active agent in that violinist's death. His underlying pathology of the kidney ailment is responsible for his death. But in the act of abortion, you are directly killing an unborn human being. And so that distinction matters, because you're not the one killing the violinist, the kidney ailment is. But in the case of abortion, you are the one who's actually actively killing the human being. So these three disanalogies between the two, I think, show that the violinist analogy is actually a false analogy, and doesn't. Number one, it doesn't accurately portray the pregnancy situation. But number two, it also doesn't do the work of justifying abortion. And so another bad way that people argue for abortion is they advance a radical bodily rights theory. And the reason that this is a radical bodily rights theory is because under no other circumstances do we allow you to harm or kill another human being in the name of your bodily rights. As people often say, your right to swing your fist ends where somebody else's nose begins. So just because the unborn human being is connected to the woman's body, that does not give her the moral right to kill or harm this child in the name of bodily rights. Okay, so that was advancing a radical bodily rights theory. Now the next one is only, you won't care about this if you're not a Christian, but this is a way that many people do try to argue for abortion. So the sixth bad way is that they twist Scripture. Now, it's true that Scripture does not have so if you're not a Christian, you can just kind of conk out for the next couple of minutes or so, because this might not be of interest. But feel free to listen in. So basically, it is true that there is no specific explicit prescription against abortion in the Bible, but to argue that the Bible condones it because it's silent on it is to make another fallacious argument that we call an argument from silence, because it doesn't follow that just because the Bible is silent on it, the Bible condones it. Because after all, the Bible is still silent on whether or not you should push somebody into a shark tank or whether you should cut the brakes on their car. So the Bible is silent on these issues, but obviously the Bible would not condone it. The Bible does tell us that you shall not murder. It also tells us that all human beings are made in God's image. And so even though there's no explicit teaching about personhood in Scripture, we do know from the science of embryology that the unborn from fertilization count as one of us. And since the unborn from fertilization are human beings, then the prescription against killing and the prescription against shedding innocent blood in Scripture certainly pertains to the unborn as well. And then just one other thing to say about this is that there's actually good reason to suppose that there's a reason that the Bible is silent on this, and that reason is being that ancient Jews and ancient Christians just were not aborting their offspring. Now, of course, as many pro-choice people will tell you, abortions have been going on since basically the dawn of time. But they were not going on amongst the Jews, and they were not going on amongst the Christians, because to the ancient Jews, children were considered a blessing. If your womb was barren, you were considered cursed, and if you had children, you were considered blessed by God. So the Jews just were not killing their children, and ancient Christians were not as well, because of course they held the Old Testament to be sacred scripture. But one of the earliest Christian documents, called the Didache, which was a first century document or second century. Devin, you can. Oh, okay. Devin doesn't know, so I don't feel quite as bad as for not knowing this off the top of my head. But it was a very early document, which is also said to be the teaching of the 12 apostles. And in the Didache, it has a very clear prescription that you shall not kill your baby via abortion or via infanticide. In fact, it calls it the way of death in that document. So the Bible is largely silent on abortion because we can implicitly get a teaching. Just like it says we should not kill Jews. It doesn't say we should not kill Jews in a Holocaust, but Jews are still valuable people made in God's image, and so the prescription against murder would be a prescription against killing them. We can infer from Scripture that we should not be murdering the unborn because they are human beings that are made in God's image, and the ancient Christians and ancient Jews just were not aborting their offspring. Okay, so they twist Scripture. Number 7, they confuse contingent evils with absolute evils. So this is something that you'll often hear, especially if you talk to a lot of Democrats who are pro-choice, and even some of the more liberal Christians, like Rachel Held Evans, who's a Christian blogger, will also make this kind of argument, that there are other kinds of pro-life issues that we need to be focusing on. And so abortion is just, one in a long list of pro-life issues. There are unjust wars we have to worry about. There's sex trafficking we have to worry about. All of these kinds of things. And the problem is that they confuse contingent evils with absolute evils. So, for example, if we're talking about wars, well, wars are not absolutely evil. They're contingent, depending upon certain criteria. Christian thinkers have developed criteria to determine whether or not a war is just. Some of those being, can you attain your purposes with a minimal loss of life? Is it a good purpose that you're going to war for? All of these kinds of things. So wars are contingently evil, but abortion is absolutely evil. Abortion is always an immoral act. There's no situation that can justify intentionally and unjustly killing your offspring. So they often confuse contingent evils with absolute evils, and the last one is they hide behind the hard cases. Now, there's no doubt that the hard cases are hard cases. That's why they're called hard cases. And they are definitely important, and they definitely bear having a discussion about them. The hard cases being, for example, the woman's life is in jeopardy, the woman's been raped, or the fetus is severely deformed. These are definitely important questions. So to say that it's a bad way to argue for abortion by hiding behind the hard cases is not to say the hard cases are not important, because they are, and they deserve being talked about, especially by pro-life people who believe that abortion is immoral. What this actually says is, and I have a lot of examples from people that I've talked to, is that pro-choice people often hide behind the hard cases and argue the hard cases front and center, and then argue that we ought to be leaving abortion legal because of these hard cases. In fact, one of the hard cases is the case of rape. And often when you talk to a pro-choice person about this situation, they'll bring up the situation of rape. And they'll use it as a way to kind of browbeat you into trying to get you to come over to their side. And so, and of course, this is not to say that all pro-choice people do this, but a lot of them do. And I have examples from people that I've talked to as well. So if they're hiding behind the hard cases, using the hard cases to try and justify all abortions, well, that's sort of like arguing that we ought to make speeding legal because someone occasionally might need to speed to rush a loved one to the hospital. And the argument just doesn't work. Just because there might be certain rare mitigating circumstances that would cause us to be able to act in a certain way does not mean that if that act is immoral, that we should not be, or that we should make all instances of that, rather than just the rare extenuating circumstance. So talking about the hard cases is certainly important, but hiding behind the hard cases is a bad way to argue for abortion. Okay, so so those are the 8 bad ways that people tend to argue for abortion. They assume that the unborn are not human. They assert rather than argue. They attack the person rather than the argument. They confuse moral claims with preference claims. They advance a radical bodily rights theory. They twist scripture. They confuse contingent evils with absolute evils, and they hide behind the hard cases. So if a pro-choice person is going to justify abortion, they have to find a way that doesn't fall under one of these 8 situations. Especially because pro-life people have an argument that life begins at fertilization and that the unborn are persons from the very beginning. So the pro-choice person needs to find a way to show that even though the unborn is a human person from fertilization, it's still permissible to kill them through abortion, or to find a way to either argue against the science of embryology that we use, which doesn't seem very likely considering that there's a scientific consensus on the science, or they need to find a way to argue that the unborn are not deserving of rights, and that's a very, very tall order, because if you care about equal rights, if you have to find what thing we all have in common that grounds our equal rights. And so if that thing is something that is held in common with the unborn, then the unborn have those equal rights as well, and they deserve protection. So I think, definitely for the time being, I think that the pro-life case for abortion is the better case, and I really don't foresee that changing. So.
All right, Clinton, good job, sir. Maybe now we can move into a time of questions. If you guys have questions, Clinton, do me a favor, and because you got the mic, just because we've got several people watching, just say that if they have a question, they can type it in, and then I'll read their question to you, and then also if you could repeat any questions.
Okay, so I'll do my best to remember to repeat questions. I kind of forgot some of them on Tuesday, but if anybody's watching via live stream and has a question, by all means, type in your question, and Devin will ask me. So, so do you have any questions from anyone here?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just because the hard cases are hard cases and they are frequently used as arguments, are there any cases where abortion would be morally acceptable?
Yeah, so I would say that there's never a case in which an abortion is morally permissible, but I have to qualify that because I think that because we have to really define what we mean by abortion. Because it's a little bit tricky to pinpoint that down, because if we just define abortion as the termination of a pregnancy, well, that would mean that natural birth would also be an abortion. So I don't think an abortion is just a termination of pregnancy. I think that abortion, the way that I think of abortion is that it's not just an unjust killing, but it's an intentional killing of the unborn human being. So any act that you perform that does not intend and does not directly kill the unborn organism, I would not consider to be an abortion. So when I say that abortions are not morally permissible, under any circumstance, what I would say is if you ever intentionally or directly kill the unborn human being, that's not permissible. But I think that if the woman's life is in jeopardy, there are steps you can take to save her life that would result in the embryo's death. But the embryo's death would be foreseen, not intended, and it would not be directly killed. So just to give an example, suppose we're talking about ectopic pregnancy, in which the embryo implants someplace other than the womb, and it's usually in the fallopian tube. And if the embryo is allowed to continue to develop, then the fallopian tube is going to burst, and she's going to hemorrhage, and will most likely die. So in that situation, there are a few different ways that the doctor can resolve that situation. One of those is by giving her a drug called methotrexate, which would basically cause the embryo to disconnect from the wall, and then the embryo would basically disintegrate inside her body. So that I would not say would be permissible, because that is directly killing the embryo. But I would say that there is another act that the doctors can do, which would be called a salpingectomy, which is where they actually remove the offending piece of the fallopian tube and put it outside her body. In that case, the death of the embryo is not intended, though it is foreseen. The intention is to save her life, but the death of the embryo is foreseen, but not intended. And you're not directly killing the embryo, you're indirectly killing the embryo because you're removing the tube from her body, and the embryo can't survive outside the tube. So you're not directly killing the embryo. The embryo is indirectly being killed by the fact that it can't survive outside the environment of the woman's body. So that's how I would answer that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with double effect reasoning, but that's basically what my answer is kind of grounded in. And another way that we can look at it is a situation of triage. If you have two people who are in mortal jeopardy and you can only save one, you want to save the one that has the greater chance of survival. So if you save the embryo's life, the mother's going to die if you refuse to remove the embryo. The mother will die, and since the embryo is too young to survive, the embryo will also die. So if you don't do anything about the embryo, you're going to lose both lives. But if you do remove the embryo, then the mother has a 100% chance of survival. It's unfortunate that her chance of being pregnant in the future will be reduced, but I think it's a small price to, or maybe not a small price to pay, but I think I think it's permissible if the act is to save her life. I think she would rather lose part of her fertility than lose her life altogether. So yeah, so that's how I would respond to that.
Thank you.
So yeah, you're welcome.
There's Miss Teresa Horner says, pro-choice people are saying that being pro-life is only being pro-birth because pro-life people do not want to feed, educate, and house the children. How would you respond to that? Maybe you could repeat that.
Yeah. Okay. So the question was that pro-choice people often say, and this is something I hear often as well, that pro-life people are not pro-life; they're just pro-birth because they only care about the fetus before it's born, but not after it's born. And so this goes back to bad way to argue number 3, that they attack the character of pro-life people instead of attacking the argument itself. Because let's say that was true. Let's say that, I don't care about children after they're born. Who cares about them? Let's just, put them into the system and that's all I care about. Well, how does that refute my argument? If my argument is that abortion is immoral because it intentionally and unjustly kills an innocent human being, well, even if I didn't care about children after they were born, that wouldn't in any way refute my argument. So my argument would still stand, and they haven't done the job of supporting their own argument. But I also think that you hear this argument all the time, and it's a very lazy slander because it's self-evidently false. I mean, for one thing, there are twice as many pregnancy care centers than there are Planned Parenthoods. So obviously, and these are all run by pro-life people who want to help the mother and the child in these situations. So just the fact that we have so many pregnancy care centers show that pro-life people do care about the pregnant woman and do care about the child. And in fact, these pregnancy care centers are always basically run by donations of money and donations of supplies. So you have pro-life people who are also donating to these pregnancy care centers to keep these children and these single mothers or these couples who are in financial situations to help try and keep them afloat. You're not going to get that from Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood will not give any sort of prenatal care. Only pregnancy care centers do. In fact, if a woman wants to keep her child, the Planned Parenthood will often refer out to a pregnancy care center. So to say that pro-life people don't care about the child after they're born is just silly. Yeah, do we have any other questions?
Can you speak to the percentages of the argument, which is the first one I've heard over the years, that what if the mother's life is in danger? And they speak to it as if it's like 99% of pregnancies.
Yeah.
When actually that question, but I don't know the percentages, is very small because of prenatal care and because most women are educated or self-educated about their pregnancy, or they can get the education. And if they take reasonable care of themselves, there's not an issue unless there's a congenital anomaly or something like that in them that makes it difficult to carry a baby. But is not the percentage really small for it to be used as such a huge argument?
Yeah. So the question is regarding women's life being in jeopardy, and that a lot of pro-choice people tend to consider that it's a really big number. And yeah, so you're absolutely right, and that's a very, very small percentage. Less than 1% of abortions are done because the woman's life is in jeopardy. Um, we live in a developed country, and there are studies that show that, in America, it's a little more dangerous to be pregnant than in other developed countries. But the reality is, according to the Centers for Disease Control, it's still less than 1% of pregnant women die in childbirth or in pregnancy. And so you also get pro-choice people using the stat that abortion is very safe because, a very, very small percentage, there are less women who die from abortions than women who die in pregnancy or childbirth. And so that's an argument you hear as well. But the problem with that is that, number one, if you compare the two CDC stats, it's only a very, very small, the number of women who die from abortions is only a little bit smaller than the women who die in childbirth or in pregnancy. So it's only a very marginal safety. But also, abortions get exponentially more dangerous as the pregnancy progresses. So it's only first trimester abortions that are safer. But also, and I don't have the argumentation on me. This is probably something I should commit to memory. But the CDC has actually come out and argued that their stats about women who die from abortions and the stats about women who die from childbirth or pregnancy are two different things, and they're gotten at by two different processes. So you can't even really compare the two to call one safer or one more dangerous than the other. And so that's how I would respond to the statistical question. But it also might be that they're also conflating two different concepts of the woman's life being in jeopardy and the woman's health being in jeopardy. Because abortion or pregnancy does have dangers that are associated with it that can be mitigated if she's receiving constant medical care, going to her OBGYN and things like that. So the dangers of pregnancy can be mitigated by receiving constant medical care. And so as Bernard Nathanson, who was the former, I think he was actually one of the founders of NARAL and one of the past presidents who eventually became pro-life, and he was a doctor who used to do abortions. As he would say, it's only life that you can compare with life. So if a woman's health is in danger, there are certain ways that doctors can tell them to counteract what's going on, but only if her life is in jeopardy is an abortion warranted, because you are taking a human life. So so in that case, it might just be conflating the concept of the health being in jeopardy and the life being in jeopardy. And for both of those different questions, I would go different ways with them and have different responses. So, yeah.
Any further questions? All right, thank you, Clinton.
Yeah, thank you.
Janet.